Northern Minnesota, October 1888. The air had a knife's edge, a promise of the brutal winter to come. The poplars had surrendered their gold, leaving skeletal branches against a steel-gray sky. In the small settlement of Northwood, men were banking earth against their cabin foundations, splitting the last of their seasoned oak and caulking the endless gaps between logs, all except Edvard Lindqvist. Edvard was digging. Not a root cellar, not a well, but long, peculiar trenches, radiating from the base of his own modest cabin like the legs of a great earthen spider. One trench snaked 70 feet toward the small cabin of the widow Pratt. Another angled 60 feet to the slightly larger home of the widow Gable and her 3 young children. A third, the longest at nearly 90 feet, aimed for the lonely bachelor shack of old Silas Croft. He wasn't just digging. He was lining these channels with flat field-stones, creating careful, rectangular tunnels about 2 feet wide and 2 feet high. The work was slow, back-breaking, and utterly baffling to his neighbors. Truett Moser, the settlement's most experienced carpenter, a man who had built 17 of the 25 cabins in their valley, leaned against a stump, arms crossed, a look of profound pity on his face. "Edvard," he called out, his voice carrying easily in the crisp air. "I've built cabins from the Ohio River to the Dakota Territory. I've seen men try 100 foolish things to cheat the cold. This is the foolishest yet. What in God's name are you building? A private graveyard for gophers?" Hoyt Dabney, the livery stable owner whose judgment of practical matters was second only to Moser's, chuckled from his wagon. "Looks to me like he's trying to bury his house, Truett. Or maybe he's just gone plain mad from the quiet." The word spread through the settlement like wildfire on a dry prairie. Mad Edvard Lindqvist was digging strange tunnels to his neighbors' homes. He'd offered them a deal that sounded like a riddle from a madhouse. He would heat all 3 of their cabins, all winter long, with the fire from his own hearth. They wouldn't have to burn a single log of their own precious hardwood unless they wanted to. The widows, desperate after the previous winter's hardships, had agreed with hesitant, worried nods. Silas Croft, too old to care about pride, had simply grunted his assent. Everyone else thought it was a cruel joke, or worse, the project of a mind unhinged by the isolation of the frontier. They laughed. It was a joke told over breakfast, a piece of gossip traded at the general store. The crazy Swede and his warm dirt fantasy. What did this quiet Finnish Swedish shipwright, a man who had spent 20 years engineering the boiler rooms of Baltic steamships, understand about thermal inertia, insulated mass, and the physics of slow combustion that a lifetime of frontier experience had caused men like Truett Moser to completely miss? The answer to that question would change how Northwood survived the winter forever. But first, there would be mockery, and a great deal of digging. If you stick with me, I promise to show you the forgotten science behind this incredible feat of frontier engineering, a principle so effective that modern building science is only just catching up. So do me a favor, hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I want to know how far these old stories are traveling. Edvard Lindqvist was not a man given to fantasy. He was a creature of grim, practical reality, shaped by the sea ice of the Gulf of Bothnia and the relentless heat of a ship's engine room. He and his wife Sina and their 2 small children, Gustav and Helmi, had arrived in Minnesota 2 years prior, lured by the promise of land and timber. What the pamphlets had not described was the cold. Not the cold of a Scandinavian winter, which was deep but dry and fought with centuries of building knowledge, but a damp, penetrating cold that seemed to seep through the very soul of the logs. Their first winter in their hastily built cabin, a standard design recommended by everyone, had been a lesson in misery. Ice formed on the inside of the walls. The water bucket, set just 10 feet from the roaring fireplace, was frozen solid each morning, Sina spent hours stuffing rags and moss into the chinking, a battle she never won. The children, Gustav and Helmi, slept in their coats, huddled together under every blanket they owned. Edvard, a man who could calculate the thermal efficiency of a triple expansion steam engine in his head, was baffled by the sheer inefficiency of the American fireplace. It was a monster that consumed a mountain of wood, yet gave back only a tiny circle of scorching heat, leaving the rest of the cabin in a frigid, drafty twilight. It heated the air, and that heated air rushed straight up the chimney flue, pulling in more cold air from 1,000 unseen cracks. He watched his neighbors and saw the same struggle magnified by poverty and infirmity. Widow Pratt's hands were so gnarled with arthritis, she could barely split her own kindling. Widow Gable, her husband lost to a logging accident, had to choose between buying firewood and buying flour for her children. Old Silas Croft was simply fading, lacking the physical strength to feed the ravenous fire that was his only defense against the wolf of winter. Edvard saw not 3 separate problems, but one systemic failure. The problem wasn't a lack of wood. The problem was the design. The conventional frontier cabin was a thermal sieve. It was built of logs, which, contrary to popular belief, are a poor insulator. A 12-inch thick pine log has an R value of about 15, but that value was rendered meaningless by the hundreds of feet of unsealed gaps between them. The chinking, a mixture of clay, mud, and grass, dried, cracked, and fell out. Air infiltration was the primary enemy, but the fireplace was the great betrayer. It operated on a simple, brutal principle of radiant heat. It warmed objects in its direct line of sight, while the rest of the room remained cold. Worse, its voracious need for oxygen created a powerful draft. For every cubic foot of hot air that went up the chimney, a cubic foot of Arctic air was pulled in from outside. It was a convection engine running in reverse, actively cooling the house it was meant to warm. A family could burn through 20 cords of wood in a single winter and still never feel truly warm. They were fighting a battle of physics they didn't understand, and they were losing. Edvard knew he couldn't fix their cabins, not without rebuilding them from the foundation up, but he could change the way heat was delivered. He didn't need to fix the leaks. He needed to bypass them entirely. He needed to turn the very ground their cabin stood on into a giant, slow, steady radiator. The work on the trenches continued through the shortening days of October. Edvard worked with a methodical, silent intensity that unnerved his critics. He laid the base of the channels with heavy, flat stones. For the walls and capstones, he used smaller field stones, mortared together with a clay and ash mixture of his own devising. It was like building 3 long stone boxes underground. Truett Moser came by again, this time with a plumb bob and a level, as if to professionally diagnose the madness. "Edvard, I've calculated it," he said, his tone that of a patient teacher explaining a simple sum to a difficult child. "Your flue to Silas's place is nearly 100 feet long. By the time the smoke gets there, it'll be colder than the air outside. The smoke won't rise. It'll back up and fill your own cabin. You're building a suicide machine." Edvard paused, wiping sweat from his brow despite the chill. He looked at the master carpenter, a man he respected for his skill with an axe and adze. "The smoke is not the heat," he said quietly. "It is just the vehicle for the heat." He then returned to his work, leaving Moser to stare, utterly perplexed. The next stage was the insulation. Hoyt Dabney watched, mystified, as Edvard's son, Gustav, hauled buckets of fine gray dust from a massive mound behind their cabin. It was wood ash, barrels and barrels of it. Saved from their cook stove and clearing fires for 2 years, Edvard poured it into the trenches, packing it carefully around the stone channels he had built, a layer nearly a foot thick on all sides. On top of the ash, he added a layer of charcoal dust and sand before finally backfilling the trenches with the excavated earth. "He's burying his own work now," Dabney reported at the stable, "packing it in useless ash. It'll turn to lye and eat the stone away by spring." Edvard's wife, Sina, watched from the doorway, her expression a mixture of wifely trust and profound confusion. "It looks like we are burying giant snakes, Edvard," she said one evening. "They are warm snakes, Sina," he replied. "They will keep the widows warm." The final piece of the system was the heart, the heater itself. In the center of his own cabin, Edvard demolished the inefficient fireplace. In its place, he began to construct a towering mass of brick, soapstone, and mortar. It was a Finnish masonry heater, a pateri. It looked like a brick altar, reaching nearly to the ceiling, with a small iron firebox door at the bottom and a complex series of baffles and channels hidden inside. From the rear of this massive structure, 3 heavily damped clay pipes diverged, feeding into the stone channels he had buried in the earth. Inside each of the neighbors' cabins, he had already, with their permission, installed the terminus, a low, wide platform of mortared fieldstone and brick, about 4 feet by 6 feet, rising just a few inches above their dirt floors. The underground channel flowed into this platform, warming the stone mass before exiting through a small 6-inch stovepipe that vented out the far wall of their cabins. The mockery lasted for 6 weeks. The validation would last for 50 years. To understand why Edvard's crazy idea worked, you have to unlearn everything a conventional fireplace teaches you about heat. The problem, as Edvard knew from his time with boilers, wasn't creating heat. It was capturing it, storing it, and releasing it where and when you wanted it. Let's talk physics. Heat moves in 3 ways: conduction, convection, and radiation. A frontier fireplace relied almost entirely on radiation, infrared waves that travel in a straight line and warm the first solid object they hit. That's why your front can be roasting while your back is freezing. It was a terribly inefficient method. It also relied on convection, but in the worst way, by sending all the hot air, the product of its combustion, directly into the sky. It lost an estimated 90% of its energy. That's 90 cents of every dollar of wood vanished. Edvard's system attacked the problem on all fronts. First, the heater. A masonry heater isn't a fireplace, it's a thermal battery. You burn a small amount of wood very hot and very fast, for maybe 2 hours. This intense fire burns incredibly cleanly, producing minimal smoke and soot. The maze of brick baffles inside the heater's core is designed to absorb the immense heat from these exhaust gases. By the time the gases exit the top of the heater, they have transferred most of their energy, up to 90%, into the surrounding masonry. The heater's surface, all 2 to 3 tons of it, then radiates gentle, consistent warmth into the cabin for the next 12 to 24 hours. No drafts, no hot spots, just steady, comfortable heat. This was the first piece of genius. The second was what he did with the still hot exhaust. While the gases leaving the heater were much cooler than those leaving a fireplace, they were still around 300 to 400 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to do useful work. This is where the underground flues, the hippocausts, came in. Truett Moser was right about one thing. If you ran an uninsulated pipe 90 feet, the heat would be gone in a hurry. But Edvard's flues were not uninsulated. They were super insulated. Wood ash is one of the best natural insulators known to man, with an R value comparable to modern fiberglass. By packing a thick layer of it around the stone channels, he created a thermal barrier. The heat from the exhaust gases had nowhere to go but forward along the channel and into the stone walls of the flue itself. Hoyt Dabney was also wrong. The ground wouldn't steal the heat, not after the first few days. Initially, the earth would act as a heat sink, but once the moisture was driven out of the soil surrounding the insulated channel, the dry earth itself became part of the thermal battery. Edvard was, in effect, heating a massive, insulated tunnel of earth that would hold its temperature for days. Finally, there was the delivery system. The heat didn't blast into the neighbors' cabins as hot air. That would have been inefficient and drafty. Instead, the warm channel passed into the stone and brick platform he had built inside their homes. This platform was another thermal battery. It would slowly heat up to perhaps 85 or 90 degrees Fahrenheit, warm and pleasant to the touch, but not hot enough to be a fire hazard. This warm slab would then heat the cabin in the most comfortable and efficient way possible, through gentle radiation and natural convection. It warmed the floor, the furniture, the people. It created a silent, invisible, and constant source of warmth that fought the cold from the ground up. He wasn't just giving them a fire, he was giving them a heated foundation. By the first week of December, the system was complete. A light, powdery snow covered the ground, hiding the scars of Edvard's digging. He began the process of curing the system, burning small fires in his masonry heater twice a day. For the first week, nothing much happened. The vast mass of the heater, the flues, and the surrounding earth were a colossal heat sink, absorbing BTUs by the million. The skeptics felt vindicated. "See," Moser said to anyone who would listen, "all that work for nothing. He's warming the center of the earth." But Edvard was patient. He knew he wasn't just heating a room, he was charging a system. By the second week, a change began. The floor in his own cabin was perpetually warm, and in the widows' cabins, the stone platforms began to lose their chill. By the third week, they were detectably warm to the touch. By Christmas, with the outside temperature hovering in the single digits, the three neighboring cabins were maintaining a temperature of nearly 60 degrees with no fire of their own. Their occupants walked around in a state of quiet disbelief. The cold had been held at bay, not by a roaring fire, but by a silent, warm floor. The real test, however, was yet to come. It arrived in the second week of January, 1889, a blue norther, the old-timers called it. A wave of Arctic air descended from Canada, plunging the temperatures to 20, then 30 below zero. Driven by a wind that scoured the landscape and drove powdery snow into every crack and crevice. It was a killer cold, the kind that froze livestock in their barns and made a man's spittle crackle before it hit the ground. For the settlers of Northwood, it was a siege. The sound of axes splitting frozen wood was constant. Smoke billowed thick and heavy from every chimney. Inside Truett Moser's expertly built cabin, the fireplace raged, consuming logs every hour. Yet the cold was winning. Frost painted crystalline ferns across the inside of his window panes. His wife and children were huddled close to the hearth, wrapped in blankets, their breath pluming in the air of their own home. He was maintaining a temperature of perhaps 45 degrees, and only by burning his winter wood supply at a terrifying rate. Hoyt Dabney was having a worse time. Two of his best horses were shivering violently in his barn, and a newborn calf had frozen to death despite being in a sheltered stall. The cold was relentless, a physical presence that defied the thickest walls and the hottest fires. But in 4 cabins, the story was different. In Edvard Lindqvist's home, the air was still and warm. The masonry heater radiated a gentle, encompassing heat. He had fired it for 2 hours at dawn and would fire it again for 2 hours at dusk. That was all. His family was comfortable, the children playing on the floor. The temperature inside was a steady 70 degrees. The true miracle was next door. On the second night of the freeze, his conscience nagging him, Truett Moser bundled himself in his thickest coat and trudged through the wind-driven snow to check on the widow Gable. He feared the worst, imagining her and her children huddled together freezing, victims of the Swede's folly. He knocked on the door, and when it opened, he was hit not by a wave of cold, but by a gentle, calm warmth. He stepped inside, stunned into silence. There was no fire in the fireplace. The air was perfectly still, without the drafts that plagued his own home. And it was warm, easily 65 degrees. The widow's 3 children were asleep, not in a pile for warmth, but in their own separate beds, with only a single quilt each. The widow herself was calmly mending a shirt by the light of a kerosene lamp. "Truett," she said, surprised, "is everything all right?" He couldn't speak. He walked across the room and placed his bare hand on the low stone platform Edvard had built. It was unmistakably, profoundly warm. A slow, steady, radiant heat soaked into his frozen fingers. He looked at the widow, his face a mask of disbelief. "Where is the fire?" he whispered. "Edvard's house," she said, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "He makes his fire, and our floor gets warm." Moser left, his mind reeling. He forced his way through the storm to Widow Pratt's cabin. The same story. The arthritic old woman was sitting in her rocking chair, knitting, her fingers nimble for the first time in years. "The warmth comes up from the floor, Mr. Moser," she explained. "It's a miracle. No smoke, no drafts, just warmth." Finally, he went to old Silas Croft's shack, the one almost 100 feet from Edvard's fire. He had to pound on the door for a full minute before the old man, who was half-deaf, opened it. Moser braced himself for a scene of frozen misery. Instead, the old man was in his shirt sleeves, contentedly smoking his pipe. The cabin was the warmest of the 3, the small enclosed space holding the heat from the radiant slab perfectly. Moser's last stop was Edvard Lindqvist's cabin. He found Edvard sitting at his table reading a book by lamplight. The masonry heater was silent, its iron door cold to the touch, yet the room was a cocoon of warmth. Truett Moser, master builder, the most respected practical man in the county, stood defeated in the center of the room. He had been so certain, so publicly, arrogantly certain, and he had been wrong. Absolutely, fundamentally wrong. "How?" Moser asked, his voice hoarse. "The smoke, the cold ground, it defies all reason." Edvard looked up from his book. There was no triumph in his eyes, only a quiet calm. He didn't gloat. He simply explained. "I am not sending them smoke, Truett. I am sending them the heat that the smoke carries. The fire heats the brick. The brick holds the heat. The ash holds the heat in the pipe. The pipe carries the heat to their stone. The stone holds the heat for them. It is a slow river of warmth, not a quick fire. It is very simple." Moser sank onto a bench. Simple. It was the opposite of simple. It was brilliant. He thought of the cords of wood he had burned in the last 2 days, the fortune in timber gone up his chimney. He thought of the widows, safe and warm, without lifting a single log. The next day at the general store, the story of Moser's midnight tour spread through the stunned community. "He's not heating their cabins," Moser told the assembled men, his voice filled with a convert's zeal. "He's heating the ground underneath them. He's turned the whole damned earth into his hearth, and we were all fools for laughing." The laughter stopped. It was replaced by awe, and then by a steady stream of visitors. Men who had mocked Edvard now came to his door, hats in hand, asking him to explain the principles. Edvard, a man of few words, would simply show them. He'd point to the heater, to the small pile of wood he used each day, and let the quiet, steady warmth of his home speak for itself. That spring, a revolution in building began in Northwood. Truett Moser, once the chief skeptic, became Edvard's most fervent partner. They didn't build any more complex multi-cabin systems. The topography and layout of the settlement made it impractical. But they applied the core principles to every new structure and retrofitted old ones. New cabins were built with a central masonry heater instead of a fireplace. Moser learned the art of building the complex interior baffles from Edvard's careful drawings. They integrated insulated underfloor heating channels, warmed by the heater's exhaust, that terminated in a stone or brick mass within the cabin. For existing cabins, they would build a smaller masonry heater outside, against a wall, and run a heavily insulated flue to a radiant stone bench built inside. The effect was transformative. By the winter of 1895, 7 years after Edvard dug his strange trenches, over 40 homes and the Newtown schoolhouse had been built or retrofitted using Lindqvist's principles. Rowena Hicks, the county recorder, who had once described his project in a letter to her sister as the sad work of a lonely man's madness, now documented the Lindqvist thermal system in her official reports. She noted that the settlement's average firewood consumption had dropped by more than 60%, and that since the adoption of the new heating methods, not a single winter death among the elderly had been recorded. The innovation spread, carried by letter and by word of mouth to neighboring counties, adapted and modified for local conditions, but always retaining the essential physics. Burn hot and fast, capture the heat in thermal mass, and release it slowly. What Edvard Lindqvist did in 1888 was not magic. It was a masterful application of engineering principles that were centuries old in his homeland, but entirely alien to the American frontier. His underground insulated flues were a rustic version of the Roman hypocaust system. His masonry heater was a technology perfected over generations in the cold climates of Scandinavia and Russia. Today we would call his creation a rudimentary district heating system, a concept that is now a hallmark of modern, energy-efficient cities. The radiant slabs in his neighbors' cabins were the direct ancestors of modern hydronic radiant floor heating. The core ideas, super insulation, thermal mass, and capturing waste heat, are the very cornerstones of cutting-edge passive house design. Edvard Lindqvist was not a primitive builder. He was a century ahead of his time. In the end, this is a story about more than just a clever way to stay warm. It's a story about the nature of a community. A conventional fireplace is a solitary, selfish thing. It demands constant tribute from one family. Edvard's solution was communal by its very design. Its efficiency was so great that one fire could serve 4 families. He saw his neighbors' problems not as their own private struggles, but as an extension of his own. A single, shared challenge to be solved with a single, shared system. The frontier didn't reward titles or boasting. It didn't care about established traditions if those traditions failed the test. It rewarded what worked. The mockery of Edvard Lindqvist lasted for 6 weeks. The warmth he created and the wisdom he shared endured for generations. That's how real progress spreads on the frontier, not through loud pronouncements or academic papers, but through the quiet, irrefutable evidence of a child sleeping soundly on a warm floor in the heart of a blizzard. Thank you for joining me on this journey into our past. If you found this story of ingenuity as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of forgotten history. And I'm curious, what's the most clever solution to a common problem you've ever seen? Let me know in the comments below. Disclaimer: this video presents a historically inspired narrative for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the building techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices such as Roman hypocausts and European masonry heaters. The application of any building techniques should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety standards, and regulations. This content does not constitute professional engineering, architectural, or legal advice.